Rack. First introduced in the Tower of London by the Duke of Exeter in 1420, this mechanically simple torture device was popular for its ability to inflict excruciating pain on prisoners in order to extract, often false, confessions. The victim would be tied to a wooden structure, such as a plank or ladder, and a system of levers would be turned to tighten the ropes holding the victim's limbs, creating excruciating tension. Torture often left victims unable to walk. In the case of Anne Askew, the religious reformer accused of heresy in 1546, her torture experience left her immobile and she had to be carried to the stake on a chair to be burned alive at Smithfield. 2. Broken wheel. A torture device used as a gruesome punishment, intended more for killing than for extracting confessions or information. The wheel was not unlike the type fitted to wagons. It had teeth or gears on its surface. The terrified victim was tied with their limbs placed between the gears. The torturer would use a hammer to crush the victim's limbs against the wheel. The inevitable result of a prolonged period of agony for the victim was that when the victim was dead or nearly lifeless, the wheel would be lifted up for onlookers to see. An alternative use of the device was to tie the prisoner outside the wheel with their feet tied to the ground. As the wheel turned, the victim's bound body would break, often resulting in instant death. 3. Rat torture. This form of sadistic torture demonstrates the worst excesses of human imagination and what it can do in the name of punishment. The victim would be strapped to a table while a mouse was placed on their chest. A metal or iron bucket or container would be placed above it to trap the mouse. A fire would then be lit above the bucket, and the mouse would panic in the heat and try to escape. Unable to escape the metal bucket, the creature would choose a gentler path, frankly descending onto the victim's chest. 3. Rat torture. This form of sadistic torture demonstrates the worst excesses of human imagination and what it can do in the name of punishment. The victim would be strapped to a table while a mouse was placed on their chest. A metal or iron bucket or container would be placed above it to trap the mouse. A fire would then be lit above the bucket, and the mouse would panic in the heat and try to escape. Unable to escape the metal bucket, the creature would choose a gentler path, frankly descending onto the victim's chest. 4. Boots. Crushing bones and limbs was a common method of torture in the Middle Ages, primarily due to the simplicity of the design and construction of the implements used. Sometimes called a Spanish boot, the boot resembled a rack on which the legs were placed in tightly fitting iron or wooden boots. Wooden wedges were then inserted, and mallets or hammers were used to hammer the wedges in even tighter, causing the bones in the victim's feet to break. 5. Skinning. Originating in the Roman period, flaying, a torture method with religious connotations, was used both as punishment and as a slow and brutal method of killing the victim. The Assyrians first used this method between 883 and 859 BC, and this brutal practice is depicted in ancient carvings depicting the victim's skin being stripped from their body using a knife. This method continued into the Middle Ages. Depending on how much skin was removed, the victim either survived or died, usually from shock or severe blood loss. 6. Thumbscrew. Used in late medieval and early modern Europe, this simple instrument was considered one of the most effective torture devices. Mechanically resembling a vice, it consisted of 2 metal plates into which the victim's thumb was placed and the vice was tightened. The instrument sometimes had protruding protrusions on the inside, making the crushing of bones even more painful. The metal prongs punctured nails and skin. The advantage for torturers was that the use of the thumbscrew rarely resulted in death or unconsciousness, allowing the brutal act to continue for extended periods. 7. Slam dunk. Often associated with the torture of so-called witches, water immersion was used as a method of extracting confessions rather than killing. The victim would be tied to a board or spring and submerged head first, then pulled out at the point of drowning. Cutting, public immersion, was also practiced as a form of humiliation. Various versions were employed, from the simple plank system to a chair suspended from a beam and lowered into the water like a seesaw. This cruel practice, widely used during the Salem witch trials in America, reached its peak during the witch hunts in England in the 16th and 17th centuries. Replicas of leaning stools can still be seen in towns and villages across the country, such as Christchurch in Dorset. 8. Coffin torture. Not to be confused with being buried alive or walled up, this highly publicized torture involved confining a person to a very small metal or wooden cage and then hanging them from a gallows or tree. The bird-like cage was tightly fitted to the body and shaped like a garment. The proximity of the metal to the skin was painful. Coffin torture was used as a punishment for alleged offenses such as blasphemy or insulting the ruler. Because it was public knowledge, angry mobs could vent their anger by throwing missiles at the victim, making the punishment both physically dangerous and emotionally traumatic. Death usually resulted from exposure to freezing temperatures or dehydration.